The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, walked through the grand corridors toward the king's private study. Her heels clicked softly against the polished marble floors, creating an echo that seemed to announce her approach. She had received an urgent message from King Charles III requesting her immediate presence, and the tone suggested this was no ordinary royal engagement. As she approached the ornate doors of the study, Catherine took a moment to compose herself. The weight of royal responsibility had become familiar over the years, but there was something different about today's summons. The French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte were arriving for a state visit, and preparations had been underway for weeks. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the ceremonial welcome to the grand state banquet that would take place in the evening. The king's private secretary opened the doors, and Catherine stepped into the room where King Charles sat behind his antique mahogany desk. Papers were scattered across the surface, and she could see documents bearing the official seals of both Britain and France. The king looked up as she entered, his expression serious but warm. He gestured for her to take a seat in one of the leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. "Catherine, thank you for coming so promptly," the king began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of diplomatic experience. "I have something rather important to discuss with you regarding tonight's state banquet." He paused, studying her face carefully before continuing. "As you know, President Macron's visit comes at a particularly significant time in Anglo-French relations. The decisions made during this visit could shape our relationship with France for years to come." Catherine nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. State visits were never merely ceremonial affairs. They were carefully orchestrated diplomatic events where relationships were strengthened, agreements were reached, and the future of international cooperation was often decided. She had participated in several such occasions since becoming the Princess of Wales, but something in the king's manner suggested this would be different. The king leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "I need someone I can trust completely to handle a very delicate matter during tonight's banquet. Someone who understands both the importance of protocol and the nuances of personal diplomacy." His eyes met hers directly. "I'm entrusting you with ensuring that a particular conversation takes place between myself and President Macron, one that could have significant implications for both our nations." Catherine felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. The king's confidence in her abilities was evident, but she also understood that whatever responsibility he was about to assign would require her to navigate the complex world of international diplomacy with extraordinary skill. She had spent years learning the intricacies of royal protocol, studying the art of conversation, and understanding how to read the subtle signs that often determined the success or failure of diplomatic encounters. "Your Majesty, I'm honored by your trust," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the emotions stirring within her. "Whatever you need me to do, I'm prepared to fulfill that responsibility." The king smiled, an expression that conveyed both relief and confidence. He reached for a folder on his desk and opened it, revealing documents that appeared to contain detailed information about the evening's proceedings. As the morning progressed, Catherine found herself drawn deeper into the world of high-stakes diplomacy. The king explained that there were certain sensitive topics that needed to be addressed with President Macron, issues that could not be discussed through formal channels but required the kind of personal touch that only a carefully orchestrated social setting could provide. The state banquet would offer the perfect opportunity for these crucial conversations to take place naturally and without the pressure of formal negotiations. The responsibility that King Charles was placing on Catherine's shoulders was both thrilling and daunting. She would need to ensure that the right people were seated in the right places, that conversations flowed in the desired directions, and that the delicate balance between personal warmth and diplomatic necessity was maintained throughout the evening. It was a role that required not just knowledge of protocol, but an intuitive understanding of human nature and the ability to guide social situations with invisible precision. King Charles reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing the royal crest. The weight of the moment settled over the room as he handed it to Catherine, his expression grave yet determined. "Inside this envelope are the details of what I need you to accomplish tonight," he said quietly. "This information is known only to myself, the Foreign Secretary, and now you. The success of President Macron's visit may very well depend on how effectively you can facilitate what needs to happen. Catherine accepted the envelope with steady hands, though her heart was racing. The paper felt substantial beneath her fingers, and she could sense that whatever was written inside would change the course of her evening entirely. She looked up at the king, waiting for permission to open it, and he nodded solemnly. As she carefully broke the wax seal, she noticed the king watching her face intently, as if gauging her reaction to what she was about to discover. The document inside was written in the king's own hand, a personal touch that emphasized the confidential nature of the mission. As Catherine read, her eyes widened slightly. The king needed her to orchestrate a private moment during the banquet where he could discuss with President Macron a potential new trade agreement that could revolutionize economic cooperation between Britain and France. However, this conversation needed to appear completely natural and unplanned, as any suggestion of formal negotiations during a state banquet could create diplomatic complications. The French delegation is unaware that this topic will be raised tonight, the king explained as Catherine finished reading. President Macron has been hoping for an opportunity to discuss these matters, but political pressures in both countries have made formal negotiations difficult. A casual conversation during the banquet, however, could open doors that have been closed for months. Catherine nodded, beginning to understand the delicate nature of her assignment. The king stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the palace gardens where staff members were already preparing for the arrival of the French delegation. You'll need to ensure that President Macron and I have approximately 15 minutes of private conversation during the reception before dinner. The challenge is making this happen without it appearing orchestrated or drawing attention from other guests or the media. He turned back to Catherine, his expression serious. Can you manage this? Catherine felt the full weight of royal responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't simply about ensuring proper protocol or making guests feel welcome. This was about potentially shaping the economic future of two nations. She thought quickly about the evening's timeline, visualizing the reception, the procession to dinner, and the various moments when such a conversation might naturally occur. Her mind raced through possibilities, considering the personalities involved and the complex dynamics of a state banquet. I believe I can arrange this, Your Majesty, Catherine replied, her voice gaining confidence as a plan began to form in her mind. If I coordinate with the master of the household and perhaps make a small adjustment to the reception timeline, I think we can create the opportunity you need. The king's face showed his relief and approval, but Catherine could see there was more to the assignment than what had been revealed so far. The king returned to his desk and opened another folder, this one containing detailed seating charts and information about each guest who would be attending the banquet. There's another element to consider, he said, his tone becoming even more serious. Brigitte Macron has expressed particular interest in discussing educational initiatives with you. While I'm speaking with the president, you'll need to engage her in conversation that will naturally draw her away from our discussion without making her feel excluded or ignored. Catherine studied the guest list, noting the presence of several high-ranking officials, diplomats, and cultural figures from both countries. Each person represented a different interest, a different perspective, and a different potential complication for the evening's carefully planned informal diplomacy. She realized that her role would require not just orchestrating one conversation, but managing multiple social dynamics simultaneously to ensure that the king's meeting with President Macron could take place smoothly. As the briefing continued, Catherine learned that there were several other subtle objectives for the evening. Certain British officials needed to make connections with their French counterparts, cultural exchanges needed to be discussed, and the overall atmosphere needed to convey warmth and cooperation while maintaining the dignity and formality appropriate for a state occasion. Every smile, every gesture, every seemingly casual remark would be observed and analyzed by diplomats, journalists, and political observers from both nations. The magnitude of her responsibility was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Catherine wasn't just attending a dinner. She was being asked to serve as an invisible conductor of a complex diplomatic orchestra, ensuring that each element played its part in creating a harmonious and productive evening. The success or failure of important international relationships could hinge on her ability to make everything appear effortless and natural while carefully managing every detail behind the scenes. After leaving the king's study, Catherine immediately made her way to the master of the household's office, her mind already working through the complex logistics of the evening ahead. Sir Edward Fitzalan Howard, a man whose expertise in royal protocol was legendary, looked up from his desk as she entered. His weathered face showed years of experience managing the most important social events in the British calendar, and Catherine knew she would need his complete cooperation to make the king's plan work. "Sir Edward, I need to discuss some adjustments to this evening's proceedings," Catherine began, choosing her words carefully. She couldn't reveal the full scope of her mission, but she needed to convey enough urgency to secure his assistance. "His Majesty has requested that I ensure certain conversations take place naturally during the reception, and I'll need your help to create the right opportunities." Sir Edward's keen eyes studied her face, and she could see him quickly assessing the implications of her request. The master of the household was accustomed to last-minute adjustments and understood that state occasions often required flexibility behind the scenes. He pulled out the detailed timeline for the evening, a document that mapped out every moment from the arrival of the French delegation to the final departure. Catherine studied the schedule intently, looking for the perfect window of opportunity where a private conversation could occur without disrupting the overall flow of events. "Perhaps we could extend the reception by 10 minutes, Catherine suggested, pointing to the timeline. "And if we could arrange for the photographers to be positioned in the blue drawing room during that period, it might naturally draw some guests away from the main reception area." Sir Edward nodded thoughtfully, understanding immediately that such an arrangement would create a quieter space where important conversations could take place without interruption or observation. Catherine then made her way to the palace's state dining room, where preparations for the banquet were already underway. The room was a masterpiece of royal grandeur, with its crimson walls, gilded ceiling, and the magnificent table that could seat 150 guests. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier's light, and the finest china bore the royal arms in gold leaf. Every detail had been planned to perfection, but Catherine now needed to ensure that the seating arrangements would support her mission. She found Lady Sarah Keswick, the lady-in-waiting responsible for protocol, reviewing the seating charts one final time. Catherine approached her with a request that required delicate handling. "Lady Sarah, I wonder if we might make a small adjustment to place Madame Macron closer to the education ministers from both countries. Her Majesty mentioned her interest in educational initiatives, and I think she would appreciate the opportunity for in-depth discussion." It was a reasonable request that wouldn't raise suspicions while serving Catherine's larger purpose. The afternoon hours flew by as Catherine coordinated with various palace staff members, each adjustment carefully designed to support the evening's hidden agenda. She met with the head butler to discuss the timing of service, ensuring that the wine would be served at precisely the right moment to encourage relaxed conversation. She consulted with the palace press secretary about media positioning, making sure that cameras would capture the warmth of the occasion without intruding on private moments. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine spent time reviewing detailed briefing materials about President and Madame Macron's interests, preferences, and recent activities. She studied transcripts of their previous public statements, learned about their personal backgrounds, and familiarized herself with current issues in French politics and culture. This preparation was essential for her ability to engage naturally in conversation and guide discussions in productive directions. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine found herself growing more confident in her ability to fulfill the king's trust. She had identified the perfect moment during the reception, when she could naturally engage Madame Macron in conversation about educational exchanges between British and French schools, a topic that would genuinely interest the French First Lady while creating space for the king's private discussion with President Macron. The logistics were falling into place, but she knew that the real challenge would come during the event itself. Catherine also took time to select her attire for the evening, understanding that every detail would be scrutinized and that her appearance needed to convey both elegance and approachability. She chose a midnight blue gown that was formal enough for the state occasion, but not so elaborate as to overshadow the guests of honor. Her jewelry was selected to complement the French delegation's colors, a subtle gesture of respect and friendship that would not go unnoticed by diplomatic observers. The final preparation involved a brief rehearsal in the staterooms, where Catherine walked through the planned route of the evening's activities. She visualized each moment, from greeting the French delegation to the crucial conversation during the reception, and finally to the formal dinner itself. Every step had been considered, every potential complication anticipated. She felt ready to serve as the invisible hand that would guide the evening toward success, knowing that the future of Anglo-French relations might depend on her ability to make diplomacy appear as natural as friendship. The sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones echoed through the palace courtyard as the French presidential convoy approached Buckingham Palace. Catherine stood at the window of the grand entrance hall, watching as the ceremonial procession made its way toward the palace. The sight was magnificent. Gleaming carriages pulled by the finest horses from the royal mews, accompanied by the household cavalry in their brilliant red uniforms and polished breastplates. This was pageantry at its finest, but Catherine's mind was focused on the delicate mission that lay ahead. President Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte stepped from their carriage with the practiced ease of experienced diplomats. Even from her vantage point, Catherine could see the genuine warmth in their expressions as they prepared to meet King Charles and Queen Camilla. The French president appeared relaxed and confident, while Madame Macron's elegant bearing and gracious smile suggested she was genuinely pleased to be making this state visit. These observations were important for Catherine's mission. She needed to read their moods and adapt her approach accordingly. The formal greetings took place in the grand entrance hall, where centuries of royal protocol were displayed in perfect choreography. King Charles and Queen Camilla welcomed their guests with the warmth that characterized British hospitality, while maintaining the dignity appropriate for such an occasion. Catherine observed carefully as the two couples exchanged pleasantries, noting the easy rapport that seemed to develop immediately between the monarchs and their guests. This boded well for the private conversation that would need to take place later. As the presidential party was escorted to their private apartments to prepare for the evening's festivities, Catherine had a few precious hours to finalize her preparations. She met briefly with Prince William, who would also play an important role in the evening's events. Though she couldn't share the specific details of her mission, she was able to coordinate with him to ensure that their actions would complement each other throughout the evening. William's natural charm and diplomatic skills would be valuable assets in managing the complex social dynamics of the state banquet. The late afternoon brought a flurry of final preparations, as palace staff put the finishing touches on arrangements that had been weeks in the making. Catherine moved through the staterooms, checking every detail and making subtle adjustments to ensure that her plan could unfold smoothly. She positioned herself strategically during these final preparations, familiarizing herself with every corner of the reception areas and identifying the quiet alcoves where private conversations could take place naturally. At precisely 6 o'clock, the guests began arriving for the pre-dinner reception. Catherine positioned herself near the entrance to the white drawing room, where she could observe and subtly influence the flow of conversation. The room filled with distinguished guests from both countries: cabinet ministers, cultural leaders, business executives, and diplomatic officials. Each person represented a different aspect of the complex relationship between Britain and France, and Catherine understood that managing these relationships was as important as facilitating the king's main objective. President and Madame Macron made their entrance to warm applause, and Catherine watched carefully as they began to circulate among the guests. She noted how naturally they engaged in conversation, how easily they moved from serious political discussion to lighter cultural topics, and how they seemed to genuinely enjoy the social aspects of their diplomatic duties. This social intelligence would work in Catherine's favor as she prepared to guide them toward the conversations that needed to take place. Catherine's moment came sooner than expected. As she approached Madame Macron during a natural lull in conversation, she was able to introduce the topic of educational exchanges between British and French schools. "Madame Macron, I understand you have a passionate interest in education," Catherine began, her French accent carefully practiced for this moment. "I've been hoping to discuss some exciting possibilities for collaboration between our country's educational institutions." The French First Lady's face lit up with genuine interest, exactly as Catherine had hoped. As their conversation deepened, Catherine was able to position them near the beautiful Canova sculpture in the corner of the room, a location that would naturally draw other guests interested in art and culture. This created exactly the kind of engaging group discussion that would allow President Macron to step away for a private word with King Charles, without it appearing planned or exclusive. Catherine watched from the corner of her eye as the king approached President Macron, and she skillfully intensified her discussion with Madame Macron to ensure her complete attention. The plan was working perfectly. While Catherine engaged Madame Macron and several education ministers in animated discussion about student exchange programs and joint research initiatives, King Charles and President Macron moved naturally toward the quieter end of the reception room. To any observer, it would appear as simply two leaders taking advantage of a social moment to have a friendly chat, but Catherine knew that this conversation could reshape economic relations between their two nations. Catherine found herself genuinely enjoying her conversation with Madame Macron, whose intelligence and passion for education were immediately apparent. They discussed everything from early childhood development programs to university partnerships, and Catherine realized that these discussions could lead to meaningful initiatives, regardless of the evening's diplomatic objectives. This authentic engagement made her role feel less like manipulation and more like genuine bridge building between two cultures. The reception room hummed with sophisticated conversation, as Catherine maintained her engaging discussion with Madame Macron about educational initiatives. From her peripheral vision, she could see King Charles and President Macron moving into their private conversation near the magnificent fireplace at the far end of the room. The positioning was perfect. They appeared to be simply two friends sharing a quiet moment away from the larger group, while the ornate mirror above the fireplace allowed Catherine to monitor their interaction without appearing to watch. Catherine's conversation with Madame Macron had attracted several other guests, including the British Education Secretary and the French Minister of Higher Education. This created exactly the kind of animated group discussion that would naturally hold attention and provide cover for the more sensitive conversation taking place across the room. Catherine found herself genuinely impressed by Madame Macron's knowledge and passion for educational reform, and their discussion of collaborative programs between British and French universities was both substantive and engaging. I particularly admire the approach that Cambridge has taken to international partnerships, Madame Macron was saying, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Perhaps we could arrange for French students to participate in more extensive exchange programs. Catherine nodded eagerly, sensing an opportunity to extend this conversation while ensuring adequate time for the presidential discussion. She began describing recent innovations in British higher education, carefully pacing her remarks to maintain engagement without rushing. Across the room, Catherine could see that King Charles and President Macron were deep in conversation. Their body language suggested that the discussion was progressing well. Both men appeared relaxed and engaged, occasionally gesturing in ways that indicated animated but friendly discourse. The king's careful preparation was evident in his confident manner, while President Macron's attentive posture suggested genuine interest in whatever proposals were being discussed. Catherine skillfully steered her group toward the windows overlooking the palace gardens, a move that created additional space between the two conversations and reduced any possibility of accidental overhearing. The garden view also provided a natural talking point about landscape architecture and cultural heritage, topics that could easily occupy the group's attention for the necessary duration. Madame Macron was particularly interested in the historical development of the palace gardens, giving Catherine perfect material to extend their discussion. The timing was crucial, and Catherine found herself managing multiple elements simultaneously. She needed to maintain genuine engagement with her conversation partners while monitoring the progress of the presidential discussion and ensuring that other guests didn't inadvertently interrupt the king's important conversation. It was like conducting an invisible orchestra, where every gesture and word needed to contribute to the overall harmony of the evening. Catherine noticed that several other guests were beginning to drift toward the king and President Macron, drawn perhaps by curiosity about what the two leaders were discussing. Without missing a beat in her own conversation, she subtly signaled to Prince William, who was speaking with a group of French cultural attachés nearby. Understanding immediately, William guided his group in a different direction, effectively creating a natural barrier that discouraged others from approaching the presidential conversation. The synchronization required for this delicate operation was remarkable. Catherine realized that successful diplomacy often depended on these invisible moments of coordination, where multiple people worked together to create the conditions for important conversations to take place. Every royal family member, every staff person, and every carefully positioned guest was playing a role in facilitating what could become a historic moment in Anglo-French relations. As the conversation with Madame Macron continued, Catherine became increasingly aware that something significant was happening across the room. The king's expression had grown more serious, and President Macron was leaning forward with evident interest. Their discussion appeared to have moved beyond pleasantries into substantive territory, exactly as the king had hoped. Catherine felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that her careful orchestration was enabling this crucial diplomatic moment. The 15-minute window that the king had requested was nearly complete, and Catherine began to prepare for the next phase of the evening. She could see palace staff beginning to position themselves for the call to dinner, and she knew that the reception would soon need to transition to the formal banquet. The timing had worked perfectly. The presidential conversation was reaching its natural conclusion just as the evening's schedule required. Movement to the next phase. Catherine caught the king's eye briefly and saw a small nod of acknowledgement that suggested the conversation had been successful. President Macron's relaxed demeanor and the warm handshake he exchanged with the king indicated that whatever had been discussed had been well received. As the two leaders rejoined the larger group, Catherine felt the satisfaction of a mission accomplished, though she knew the evening's challenges were far from over. The sound of the master of ceremonies announcing dinner echoed through the reception rooms as guests began to move toward the state dining room. Catherine felt a sense of relief mixed with anticipation. As the first phase of her mission concluded successfully, the king's brief but meaningful glance in her direction confirmed that the private conversation with President Macron had achieved its intended purpose. Now came the equally important task of ensuring that the state banquet itself reinforced the positive atmosphere that had been established during the reception, and the procession to dinner was a masterpiece of royal protocol, with guests moving in carefully ordered precedence through the magnificent staterooms. Catherine walked with the other members of the royal family, her position allowing her to observe the interaction between the British and French delegations. The warm conversations and easy laughter suggested that the evening's diplomatic objectives were being met, but she remained alert for any signs that additional subtle intervention might be needed. The state dining room had been transformed into a breathtaking setting worthy of the historic occasion. The massive mahogany table gleamed under the light of 3 enormous crystal chandeliers, while gold plate and the finest crystal created a display of royal magnificence that never failed to impress visiting dignitaries. The floral arrangements, featuring both British roses and French lilies, symbolized the friendship between the two nations in a way that was both beautiful and diplomatically meaningful. Catherine found herself seated strategically between the French ambassador and a prominent British businessman with extensive interests in France. This positioning allowed her to continue her role as a bridge between the two cultures while monitoring the broader dynamics of the dinner conversation. She could see that King Charles and President Macron, seated near each other at the head table, were continuing their dialogue in the relaxed atmosphere that formal dinners often provided for deeper discussion. As the first course was served, Catherine engaged her dinner companions in conversation about the cultural exchanges that had enriched both British and French society. The French ambassador proved to be a charming conversationalist with extensive knowledge of British history, while the businessman shared fascinating insights about the practical aspects of Anglo-French economic cooperation. Their discussion provided Catherine with valuable context for understanding how the evening's diplomatic initiatives might be implemented in practical terms. The dinner conversation flowed naturally between serious topics and lighter cultural discussions, exactly as Catherine had hoped. She observed that Madame Macron was thoroughly enjoying her conversation with the education ministers, building on the foundation that had been established during the reception. This continuation of their earlier discussion suggested that genuine partnerships might emerge from the evening's social diplomacy, extending the impact beyond the immediate political objectives. Catherine noticed that throughout the dinner, Both King Charles and President Macron seemed more relaxed and engaged than they had appeared in recent public appearances together. The private conversation during the reception had clearly established a foundation of trust and understanding that was now influencing the broader tone of the evening. This was exactly the kind of outcome that skillful diplomatic facilitation was designed to achieve. As the evening progressed through multiple courses of exquisite cuisine, Catherine found herself genuinely enjoying the sophisticated company and stimulating conversation. The French delegation had clearly been impressed by the warmth of their reception and the evident effort that had gone into making them feel welcome. These positive feelings would undoubtedly influence their perception of Britain and potentially affect future diplomatic negotiations in ways that formal meetings could never achieve. The traditional toasts provided an opportunity for both leaders to speak publicly about the friendship between their nations. King Charles's toast emphasized shared values and common challenges, while President Macron's response highlighted the potential for increased cooperation in areas ranging from climate change to cultural exchange. Catherine listened carefully to both speeches, noting how they built upon themes that had likely been discussed during their private conversation. Catherine realized that her role had evolved throughout the evening, from orchestrating specific conversations to serving as a living bridge between two cultures. Her interactions with French guests had been genuinely enriching, while her observations of British-French dynamics had given her new insights into the complexities of international diplomacy. The evening had become both a professional success and a personal learning experience that would influence her approach to future royal duties. As the dinner drew toward its conclusion, Catherine felt confident that the evening had exceeded even the king's optimistic expectations. The combination of formal protocol and genuine human connection had created an atmosphere where important diplomatic business could be conducted naturally and effectively. The state banquet had served its intended purpose of strengthening relationships while maintaining the dignity and grandeur appropriate for such an historic occasion. As the final guests departed Buckingham Palace in the early hours of the morning, Catherine found herself walking through the now quiet staterooms with King Charles. The chandeliers still sparkled overhead, but the rooms that had been filled with diplomatic energy and sophisticated conversation now held only the peaceful silence that follows a successful gathering. Palace staff moved efficiently to restore order, but their quiet satisfaction was evident in their manner as they worked. "Catherine, I cannot adequately express my gratitude for what you accomplished tonight," King Charles said as they paused in the blue drawing room where the evening's crucial conversations had taken place. "Your ability to create the conditions for natural diplomatic dialogue was remarkable. President Macron and I were able to discuss matters that would have been impossible to address through formal channels, and I believe we've established a foundation for significant progress in Anglo-French relations." The king went on to explain that the private conversation had indeed covered the sensitive trade negotiations that had been stalled for months. President Macron had expressed genuine enthusiasm for the proposals that King Charles had outlined, and they had agreed on a framework for moving forward that could benefit both nations economically. More importantly, they had established a personal rapport that would facilitate future diplomatic cooperation on a wide range of issues. Catherine felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she reflected on the evening's events. Her role had required not just protocol expertise and social skills, but also the ability to read complex interpersonal dynamics and adapt her approach in real time. The success of the mission had depended on countless small decisions and subtle interventions that had shaped the flow of the evening without anyone being aware of their calculated nature. The conversation with Madame Macron had also produced unexpected benefits beyond its original purpose of providing cover for the presidential discussion. The French First Lady had expressed genuine interest in developing educational partnerships between British and French institutions, and she had invited Catherine to visit France to explore these possibilities further. This invitation could open doors for cultural and educational exchanges that would strengthen ties between the two nations for years to come. Prince William joined them in the drawing room, having just finished seeing off the last of the French delegation. His role in the evening's success had been equally important, as his natural diplomatic skills and ability to engage guests in meaningful conversation had helped create the relaxed atmosphere that made everything else possible. The collaboration between family members had demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated royal diplomacy. The French ambassador mentioned to me that this was one of the most successful state visits he could remember, William reported. He said that the combination of formal protocol and genuine warmth had created exactly the kind of environment where real diplomatic progress could be made. President Macron apparently told his staff that he felt more optimistic about British-French relations than he had in years. As they discussed the evening's outcomes, Catherine realized that her mission had implications far beyond the immediate diplomatic objectives. The skills she had developed and demonstrated tonight would serve her well in future royal duties, and the confidence that King Charles had shown in her abilities suggested that she would be entrusted with increasingly important responsibilities in international relations. This recognition of her capabilities was both gratifying and inspiring. The king shared some of the specific details of his conversation with President Macron, revealing how the natural setting of the reception had allowed them to explore possibilities that would have been constrained by the formal atmosphere of official negotiations. They had discussed not only trade issues but also cooperation on climate change initiatives, cultural exchanges, and joint approaches to global challenges. The personal trust that had been established would make future collaborations much more likely to succeed. Catherine understood that nights like this one were rare in royal life, moments when personal skills and diplomatic necessity converged to create opportunities for genuine historical impact. The success of the mission had required months of preparation, careful coordination among multiple participants, and the ability to execute complex social choreography while making everything appear effortless and natural. It was a reminder of why royal duties, properly executed, could have profound effects on international relations. As the three of them finally made their way to their private quarters, Catherine reflected on how the evening had changed her understanding of her role as Princess of Wales. She was not simply a ceremonial figure or a representative of tradition. She was an active participant in shaping her nation's relationships with the world. The trust that King Charles had placed in her tonight was a recognition of her growth and capabilities, and it pointed toward a future where she would play an increasingly significant role in British diplomacy. The state banquet had concluded successfully, but Catherine knew that its real impact would be measured in the weeks and months to come. As the relationship strengthened and agreements reached during the evening, translated into concrete benefits for both nations. Her invisible role in facilitating these outcomes had been crucial, and the experience had prepared her for even greater responsibilities in the complex world of international relations that lay ahead.